In the middle of the square came some Comacs to display their skill in having intercourse with women on horseback. One of them stripped off his uniform, leaving only his boots on his hairy legs. He rode his horse in circles, and then neatly lifted off the ground a naked woman brought to him by the others. He made her sit astride the horse in front of him and facing him. The horse broke into a faster trot. The rider pulled the woman closer, making her lean her back against the horse's mane. At every lunge, he penetrated her afresh, shouting triumphantly each time. The others greeted his performance with applause. The rider then deftly turned the woman around so that she faced forward. He lifted her slightly and repeated his feat from the back while clutching her breasts. Encouraged by the others, another Comac jumped on the same horse behind the woman, and with his back to the horse's mane. The horse groaned under the load and slowed down, while the two soldiers raped the fainting woman simultaneously. Other feats followed. Helpless women were passed from one trotting horse to another. One of the Comacs tried to couple with a mare. Another roused a stallion and tried to push a girl under it, holding her up by her legs. I crept deeper into the bushes, overwhelmed by dread and disgust. Now I understood everything. I realized why God would not listen to my prayers, why I was hung from hooks, why Galbos beat me, why I lost my speech. I was black. My hair and my eyes were as black as these Comacs. Evidently, I belonged with them in another world. There could be no mercy for such as me. Some dreadful devil has sentenced me to have black hair and eyes in common with these hordes of savages. Suddenly, a tall, white-haired old man came out of one of the barns. The peasants called him the Saints, and because he thought of himself as such. He held with both hands a heavy wooden cross, and he wore on his white head a wreath of yellowed oak leaves. His sightless eyes were lifted to the sky. His bare feet, deformed by age and disease, sought a path. The words of a psalm came in a mournful dirge from his toothless mouth. He was pointing at the cross, at his unseen enemies. The soldiers sobered for a moment. Even the drunken ones eyed him uneasily, visibly disturbed. Then one of them ran to the old man and tripped him. He fell down and lost his grip on the cross. The Comacs jeered and waited. The old man tried with stiff movements to rise himself, groping for the cross. His bony, gnarled hand searched the ground patiently while the other soldiers flipped the cross away with his foot and got close to it. The old man crawled around, babbling and moaning softly. Finally he was exhausted and breathed heavily with a hoarse wheeze. The Comac lifted the heavy cross and stood it upright. It balanced for a second and then toppled over to the prone figure. The old man moaned and ceased to move. A soldier threw a knife at one of the girls who was trying to crawl away. She was left bleeding in the dirt. No one paid any attention to her. Drunken Comacs handed women spattered with blood from one to another, beating them, forcing them to perform odd acts. One of them rushed into the house and brought out a small girl of about 5. He lifted her high so that his comrades could see her well. He tore off the child's dress. He kicked her in the belly while her mother crawled in the dust begging for mercy. He slowly unbuttoned and took down his trousers, while still holding the little girl above his waist with one hand. Then he crouched and pierced the screaming child with a sudden thrust. When the girl grew limp, he threw her away into the bushes and turned to her mother. In the doorway of the house, some half-naked soldiers were fighting a powerfully built peasant. He stood on the threshold swinging an axe in wild fury. When the soldiers finally overcame him, they dragged a fear-numbed woman out of the house by her hair. 3 soldiers sat on the husband, while the others tortured and raped his wife. Then they dragged out two of the man's youthful daughters, seizing a moment when the Commac's grip on him loosened. The peasant jumped up and dealt a sudden blow to the nearest one. The soldier fell down, his skull crushed like a swallow's egg. Blood and white pieces of brain, resembling the meat of a cracked nut, spilled through his hair. The enraged soldiers surrounded the peasant, overpowered him, and raped him. Then they castrated him in front of his wife and daughter. The frantic woman rushed to his defense, biting and scratching. Roaring with delight, the Commac's held her fast, forced her mouth open, and pushed the bloody scrapes of flesh down her throat. One of the houses caught fire. In the resulting commotion, some peasants ran for the forest, dragging with them the half-conscious woman and stumbling children. The Commac's, firing at random, trampled some of the people with their horses. They captured new victims, whom they tortured on the spot. I crouched, almost paralyzed with fright, in the raspberry bushes. Drunken Commac's were wandering around, and my chances of remaining there unnoticed were dwindling. I could not think any more. I was frozen with terror. I closed my eyes. When I opened them again, I saw one of the Commac's staggering in my direction. I flattened myself on the ground even more and nearly stopped breathing. The soldier picked some raspberries and ate them. He took another step into the bush and trod onto my outstretched hand. The heel and the nails of his boot dug into my skin. The pain was excruciating, but I did not move. The soldier leaned on his rifle and urinated calmly. Suddenly he lost his balance, stepped forward, and stumbled over my head. As I jumped up and tried to run, he grabbed me and stuck me in the chest with the butt of his rifle. Something cracked inside. I was knocked down, but I managed to trip the soldier. As he fell, I ran zigzaggily away from the house. The Commac fired, but the bullet ricocheted off the ground, and whizzed by. He fired again, but was some distance away. I tore off a board from one of the barns, climbed in, and hid in the straw. In the barn, I could still hear the cries of people and animals, rifle shots, and cracking and burning sheds and houses, the neighing of horses, the raucous laughter of the Commac's. A woman moaned softly from time to time. I burrowed deeper into the straw, though every moment hurt me. I wondered what had broken inside my chest. I put my hand against my heart. It was still beating. I did not want to be a cripple. Despite the noise, I dozed off, exhausted and frightened. I woke up with a start. A powerful explosion rocked the barn. Some beams fell. A cloud of dust obscured everything. I heard scattering rifle fire and continuous rattle of machine guns. I peered out cautiously and saw horses, panicking and galloping away, and half-naked Commac's, still drunk, trying to jump on them. From the direction of the river and from the forest I could hear the gunfire and roar of the engine. An airplane, with a red star on its wing, flew low over the village. The cannonade ceased after a while, but the noise of the engines grew louder. It was obvious the Soviets were near. The Red Army, the commissars, had arrived. I dragged myself out, but the sudden pain in my chest nearly knocked me over. I coughed and spat out some blood. Some bone was sticking inside my ribs. I struggled to walk and soon reached the hill. The bridge was gone. The big explosion must have blown it up. Tanks were crawling slowly from the forest. They were followed by helmeted soldiers strolling casually, as if it were a Sunday afternoon walk. Closer to the village, some Commac's were hiding behind the haystacks. But when they saw the tanks, they came out, still staggering, and raised their hands. They threw away their rifles and revolver belts. Some fell to their knees, begging for mercy. The red soldiers rounded them up, systematically prodding them with bayonets. In a very short time, most of them were captured. Their horses calmly grazed nearby. The tank had stopped, but new formations of men kept emerging from the forest. A platoon appeared on the river. Sappers examined the ruined bridge. Some planes flew overhead, dipping their wings and greeting. I was somehow disappointed. The war seemed to be over. The fields around the village were now filled with machines. Men set up tents, field kitchens, and strung out telephone wires. They sang and spoke language that resembled the local dialect. Though it was not intelligible to me, I knew it was Russian. The peasants watched visitors uneasily. When some of the red soldiers showed their Comac-like Uzbek or Tartar faces, the women screamed and recoiled with fear, even though the faces of the recent arrivals were smiling. A group of peasants marched into the field, carrying red flags with clumsy painted hammers and sickles. The soldiers greeted them with cheers, and regimental commander came to his tent to meet the delegation. He shook hands and invited them inside. The peasants were embarrassed and took off their caps. They had not known what to do with the flags, and finally deposited them outside the tent before entering. Besides a white truck with a red cross painted on its roof, a white-coat doctor and his orderlies were treating the wounded men and children. The crowd circled the ambulance, curious to see everything that was being done. Children followed the soldiers, asking for sweets. The men lifted them up and played with them. At noon, the village learned that the red soldiers had hanged all the captured Comacs by the legs of the oak tree of the river. Despite the pain in my chest and my hand, I dragged myself there, followed the crowd of curious men, women, and children. One could see the Comacs from the distance. They were hanging from the trees like sapless, overgrown pine cones. Each of them had hung on a separate tree, dangling by their ankles, his hand tied behind his back. Soviet soldiers were friendly, smiling faces, walked around calmly, rolling cigarettes from pieces of newspaper. Although the soldiers did not allow the peasants to come near, some of the women, recognizing their tormentors, began to curse and throw chunks of wood and dirt at the limp, hanging bodies. Ants and flies crawled over the strung-up Comacs. They crept in their mouths open and the nose and eyes. They set up their nests to their ears. They swarmed over their ragged hair. They came in thousands and fought for the best spots. The men swung in the wind, with some of them revolved slowly like sausages smoking in a fire. Some shuddered and uttered a hoarse shriek or whisper. Others seemed lifeless. They hung with wide, unblinking eyes, and the veins in their necks swelled monstrously. The peasants lit a bonfire nearby, and whole families watched the hanging Comacs, recalling their cruelties and rejoicing over their end. A gust of wind shook the trees. The bodies swung shivering in widened circles. The watching peasants made the sign of the cross. I looked over for death and felt the breath in the air. It had face of dead Marta as it romped along its oak branches, brushed its hanging men gently, entwining them with cobwebby threads which it spun from a translucent body. It whispered treacherous words in the ears. It caressed, tickling a chill to their hearts. It strangled their throats. It was nearer to me than ever. I could almost touch its airy sound, gaze into its misty eyes. I stopped in front of me, preening itself cautiously, hinting at another meeting. It was not afraid of it. I hoped to take it along for the side of the forest, to the fathomless marshes where branches dip, and steaming cauldrons bubbling with sulphurous fumes, where one hears the night and thin, dry chatter of coupling ghosts, and the endless whining of the wind in the treetops like a violin in a distant room. I reached out my hand, but death vanished along with the trees and the burden of the rustling leaves and heavy crop of hanging corpses. Something seemed to burn inside of me. My head was spinning. I was covered with sweat. I walked toward the riverbank. The moist breeze cooled me, and I sat down on a log. The river was wide here. Its swift current carried timber, broken branches, strips of sackcloth, bunches of straw, and wildly swirling eddies. Now and again the bloated body of a horse floated by. Once I thought I saw a bluish, rotted human body hovering just near the surface. For a moment the waters were clear. Then came a mass of fish killed by the explosions. They rolled over, flowed along upside down, and crowded together as if there were no longer room for them in the river to which the rainbow had brought them too long ago. I was shivering. I decided to approach the red soldiers, though I was not sure how they would look upon people with black, bewitching eyes. As I passed by the array of hanging bodies, I thought I recognized the man who had hit me with his rifle butt. He swung in a wide circle, open-mouthed and fly-ridden. I turned my head up inadvertently to get a better view of his face. A pain again pierced my chest.